Today I'm doing something that I don't usually do. I'm doing something that I said I would rarely do. Today I'm departing from the lectionary. The lectionary is those set of readings that are put out by the World Church for every Sunday and every festival of the church's year. And usually I stick to them irrespective of whether I like them or not. But today I'm departing from them. And I'm doing that because I want to talk about the Gospel of Mark. I want to talk about that all-important first gospel without which you probably wouldn't be sitting here and I certainly wouldn't be standing here. Because that gospel has been significant in shaping for us the story of Jesus that we know and our liturgical year. So what I want to share this morning are some introductory comments about the Gospel of Mark, preliminary to the conversation that we will have after church, if you wish to stay, that is, and participate in delving a little deeper. Today, after church, is the first of two conversations that John, Sam and I are looking forward to have. So, in a way, today is a bit of an old-fashioned teaching sermon. But not what we usually have here, but it's what we're having today. The Gospel of Mark, as I mentioned, is foundational to our understanding of the story of our Christian faith. It was the first of the Gospels to be written, despite the fact it comes second in our list of Gospels. But it was written first and about 40 years after Jesus' death, in a time of considerable unrest and disturbance and oppression and deprivation. It's unlikely to have been written by a man named Mark, and like most of the Gospels, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know who wrote them either, but they're assigned names. We do know that the way in which it is written, that is, its attempt to make a story out of the collection of remembered sayings and aphorisms that were circulating at the time and attributing to Jesus, set the model for what we understand a gospel to be. You know, the word gospel, as you know, just simply means good news, and it wasn't until about 200 CE that what we have in those books became known as Gospels, when gospel became a particular genre of writing within the biblical material. So Mark was the first who did that, collecting the sayings together, collecting the memories together about Jesus, and putting them in a narrative form. Mark, in many ways, created the Jesus and his life that we are so familiar with. And I want to emphasize Jesus that we're familiar with, not the post-crucifixion Christ that Paul and his earlier writings is more interested in. Mark was interested in setting out the good news of God's work through Jesus, through that very human person, Jesus, his teaching and his actions, through which Mark underlines over and again we see God at work in our world. There is some suggestion, however, that there's another purpose lying beneath the telling of the story of Jesus of Nazareth, that peasant artisan who became an itinerant preacher and leader of a revolutionary reform movement within Judaism. And that is the shaping of a lectionary of readings for festivals for Jewish followers, for Jesus followers within the Jewish synagogues. Did you get that? He was setting lectionaries, setting a set of readings for the Jesus followers who were still part of the Jewish synagogues. And we need to remember that in Mark's region, in the early stages of the development of what became Christianity, the followers were members of the local synagogue. They were adherents of Judaism. But the Christian story and life was beginning to take shape, and there was a feeling that maybe they needed a different way of celebrating the year and the festivals that focused on the Jesus good news rather than the Jewish traditions. But so very close. It might be curious to note about now that although the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel for this year, for the church's year that covers most of 2018, you've not heard much about it yet, not much from it yet. And if you wonder why, you might recall that there are no birth stories in Mark's Gospel. We heard the beginning of Mark's Gospel, but it didn't begin with any birth stories. Mark doesn't have any. Most of our familiar parables are missing. And nor are there any post-Easter resurrection appearances either. And that's a bit of a problem for the church in this Easter season. Hence, we're going back to John, who's got a lot of them. There seem to be some obvious gaps in the story, and it's very difficult for us to read this gospel without the additional infill stories provided by Matthew, Luke, and John that have coloured what we remember as the story. But just because these other gospels were written later does not make them more historically accurate, nor proof they had recourse to a greater number of reliable documents. We just don't know that, but there's no evidence of it. Each of the four Gospels were written in a different context and addressed a different set of contextual issues. I've already noted there's some exploration these days into the development of parallel lectionary for Jesus followers to the synagogue lectionary and festival readings. Mark uses a structure that reflects the shape of the Jewish year, which points towards some theologians and biblical scholars exploring that. Jesus' baptism, he begins with that, and the stories that indicate the emergence and the purpose of Jesus' ministry. And of course, in those stories, as you heard this morning, Mark is underlying Jesus' particularly special relationship with God. This is my Son, who I'm well pleased, and the dove and Spirit descend and listen to him. And this is the Son of God, as Mark puts it. But when he says Son of God, he's not talking about a divine person, Jesus. He's talking about a particular type of relationship with God, because for Mark, Jesus is a very human person. Later he talks about him as the Son of Man, and that comes from the book of Daniel, but it particularly means a human, simply means a human person, a representative of the human race. So he's trying to tell us who this important man is. Then he has a period that also parallels the Jewish calendar, a teaching period in which he instructs his disciples on the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And in that part, we hear a lot of the healing stories that point towards social change and salvation, that point towards Jesus speaking truth to power at every opportunity he gets, to the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, to the Roman governors, to the people who challenge him, to the people who follow him. Mark's Jesus does not like injustice. He does not like it. And always Mark is pointing towards the preaching and teaching towards social change. More than that, and this was very radical in its day, and this is something that is incredibly hard for us to understand, but some suggest Mark is actually democratizing access to spiritual values and well-being. No longer do the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes control it. Jesus is breaking that down, and everybody is included in the love of God and access to God. And then, of course, in Mark, again, following this Jewish tradition, passion, we come to the Passover, the passion and crucifixion, which some would argue is where we should start. But we have to say that more commonly, it has been thought that as the second coming, that the Jesus followers were expecting had not happened, it was important to organise the available oral tradition in a way that gave gravitas to the intentions of those who had committed themselves to the way of Jesus. And the writer therefore makes extensive use of references to the First Testament, especially Isaiah and Micah and Deuteronomy. These references would have been familiar to Jewish people and added credibility to Mark's Jesus as he takes shape. Mark was writing for his Jewish community living under Roman occupation on the edge of Galilee, or southern Syria, as we know it today, and speaking into that environment, into that occupation and oppression, truth to power, both religious and colonial power. Mark's style of writing would have been very familiar to his hearers, and by that I mean he was not recording the truth of history as we understand it today, verifiable by external documents or eyewitness reports, but rather pointing towards a deeper truth relating to the human condition and desires that is available to us through myth and story, through the actions of our heroes and the aspirations of our communities. Mark was linking Jesus with the First Testament prophets, with the stories of hope and challenge that they presented to his Jewish contemporaries. So when we read Mark with our post-Enlightenment eyes, we need to take care that we do not find ourselves in the place of what is called category confusion, in which we read metaphors as descriptions and myths as history. Truth lies within them. This is an action-packed, rapidly moving story aiming to help adherents and others with an interest to locate the significance of Jesus, to help them find the courage to live the Jesus way, the way leading to change in social ordering, in religious ordering and practice, and in the priorities of the religious frameworks. You know, he challenges them by saying the Sabbath was made for people, not the people for the Sabbath. He's really thumbing his nose at the institutions of religious frameworks at that point. And he invites committed discipleship from all of us. Mark invites committed discipleship from all of us, not just those fishermen to whom the story tells us was first called. To this end, Mark's gospel, I believe, holds for us the key to unlock the complexities of our Christian faith. It tells in narrative form the story of Jesus without recourse to rearranging the matters of the universe or the Christmas card and carol images that we've got pasted on our eyeballs. It represents for us the metaphors and myths that surround First Testament prophets and heroes and attaches them to Jesus to underscore his place in Jewish expectation and to reassure followers that God's plan is unfolding. It calls for those followers to be courageous in the face of oppression and persecution and to hold fast to the vision of mutual care and concern among people. Hold fast to hope and to courage. It uses everyday life examples to teach us the way, encouraging us to be awake and aware of what is going on in our world and to act towards each other with compassion, bringing healing and wellness, because that's God's work. It reminds us that in Jesus we can glimpse the God of justice, beloved by Jews, as well as the love and concern of the God as we Christians proclaim God. And so, echoing Jesus' invitation according to Mark, repent, that is, turn away from all that is unkind and divisive, and have courage. Repent and believe in the good news. The good news Know that God is at work in the world, transforming and healing, and know that you are invited to be a partner in that work. For this is the good news that Mark unfolds for us.